Welcome to Fade to PB8. In this episode, we'll be coloring in a frog sitting on a lily pad in a pond in a forested area. So the background here is actually kind of complicated because there's a lot going on. We've got some leaves and trees, we've got the sky, and we've got some bushes. So where to begin? Well, I always say go light to dark because you can always go darker. And the same kind of applies here. I decided to start with the sky because it's a light blue, whereas the leaves and the trees are going to be a medium green or a medium brown. So if I accidentally color in a bush blue, I can easily go over that with a medium green later, and you won't even see the blue in the end. Whereas if I had started with the greens and I accidentally colored in part of the sky green, it'd be really hard to correct that, and I'd have to get very creative on how to fix that, or I just have to start over. So I work a fade here. The horizon's a little bit lighter than the top of the page, but it's kind of hard to do a fade when you've got a lot of branches and things in the way. So just do your best. Now these sky colors are pretty close together, so it's relatively easy to do a fade, but you're going to want to go over it probably 2 or 3 times. Start with your lightest marker, go to your second lightest marker, and then, in this case I use 3 markers, go to your third lightest marker at the very top, and then kind of work your way backwards. Go, if it's labeled 1, 2, 3 as in lightest, second lightest, third lightest, go 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, or 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 3, 3, 2, 2, 1, or something like that. You know, you want to work your way up and then work your way back down, back to the lightest blue, and that's just how you get a good fade. So, like I said, I always like to go light to dark, and the reason why is because it's just, you can always go darker, and if you make a mistake with a light marker, you can just go over it with a darker marker and fix it. And then also, when you go light to dark, we really like to work with wet paper, and every single time you apply a new layer of ink, the paper gets slightly more damp. And when it gets more damp, it's just easier to blend, it's easier to change the color, it's easier to actually go lighter. If you let the ink dry all the way and you try to go lighter, you can't really do that. But as long as the ink is wet, that is a possibility. So we like to start light, and I do that for the trees here. I start with this very light orange, and it just kind of gives me an idea of what the trees are going to look like. I eventually go over this color, this light orange that I'm putting down. I eventually go over it with a medium brown, so you're not even going to see this color in the end. But it's a good way to start with a really light color, just because we're getting the paper wet and we're just getting the image started. And also, we're kind of forming the image, kind of like a piece of clay that we're forming into like a little character. I'm not going straight for the finishing touch. I'm not going straight for that final color. I'm working my way up to it, and then as I work my way up to it, the paper gets more and more wet, and then it's just easier to blend and make corrections, and so on. Now, I typically say do all of one section at one time. So normally I would do all the trees at once, but in this case I decided to split in half, do the trees on the left, followed by the trees on the right. And the reason why I like to do it all at once is because there might be 20 or 30 different steps that you follow to get to your final result. You might go marker A, marker B, marker G, marker F, marker X, marker S, and so on. And you have to follow that same process, those same steps, in order for it to be consistent. So I have to remember the order in which I use the markers on the left trees and repeat those same steps for the trees on the right. Otherwise, it just might not look the same. And you can get pretty close and it'll be fine, but I like to try to be as consistent as possible. The reason I split it up here is just because these trees took a little while. It's not a huge surface area, but we've got a lot of small, thin branches, and I'm switching between markers a lot. And I like to work with that wet ink. So if you have to kind of keep in mind, like, not only how large is the surface area that you're working on, but how complicated is it? That sky, again, it's a small surface area, but we've got a lot of branches and twigs and things like that in the way, and that just slows you down. So you want to kind of monitor just how wet the paper is. If it's really dry, It's not going to blend well. The ink is going to dry up quickly. And if you put down a dark marker on dry paper, it's going to dry up fairly quickly, and it's going to be hard to correct later. So here I come in again. I'm starting on the trees on the right, and I'm just trying to follow those same steps. Again, with this first marker, I'm going to end up just going over it with a darker marker, and you can kind of compare. This is kind of fun. You can look at the trees on the left and look at the trees on the right, and see how I transform the trees on the right to look like the trees on the left. Because the end result, they actually do look. They look like I did it all at once. So I have my light source kind of to my right. As a right-handed person, it's generally easier to have your light source on the right. That's not to say you can't have it on the left. It's just easier on the right. And this is a clear blue sky. I'm assuming the sun is kind of behind me and to the right a little bit, but it's not going to be really shadowy. And that actually makes the drawing a little bit easier to do. It just makes it makes it easier to just kind of do each object by itself. Now, if there was like a light source, like a very specific light source, say even on the paper, like a light bulb or a fire, then you have to work in shadows and try to get everything to go together. But in this case, it's so bright out that I'm not too worried about the shadows of the trees being cast onto the bushes, just because it's just so bright. And that just makes it easier. So if you're looking for an easier image to do, it's one where each section can kind of be done independently, and you don't have to worry about them going together. Now, you still want to match the tones and get the darknesses the same. If you're using Ohuhu brand, which I do, and they have a new coding system, the last digit or 2 digits indicates how dark it gets, and it's a number between 0 and 16, 0 being the lightest, 16 being the darkest. And you want to try and monitor how the darkest marker that you get to. So for these, I might get up to E612, and that 12 indicates it's 12 out of 16 on the darkness scale. So I don't really want to get any darker than 12 on like any other part of the drawing. So for the frog, I might go YG312, and that's going to say, okay, we're using a yellow-green in the 3 series, and the darkness is going to be 1, 2. So I try to keep that consistent, and that'll just help everything go together. There are exceptions, of course. Not always does like a 1, 2 indicate that they're all going to be the same exact darkness, but it's pretty good. It's pretty close. So it's a good way to start if you're not really sure what markers to choose. It's a good tool to help you pick the right markers. So for the leaves here on the trees, I start light, I go dark, and I kind of scatter around the light greens and just generally work my way up. Then I throw in some yellow greens here, and I'm just trying to make it look non-monotone. You know, I want it to be gradients. I want it to look natural. And what's fun about things in nature is actually quite forgiving when you're trying to color it in. Let's say your greens just aren't perfectly even, or it's a little splotchy. That's fine. It actually makes it look a little bit more natural. I always find that man-made objects are a little bit tougher to color in, just because the colors are more uniform, the fades are more consistent, and it's just more apparent if you make a mistake on a man-made object that has like very fine curvature, whereas something in nature is just kind of chaotic, and it's okay to have a dark spot here or a light spot there, because it could just be like that naturally. So if you're starting off, I recommend starting with something in nature, because it's just easier. It's much more forgiving. There's a lot more possibilities, and it'll still look good. Now for these bushes, I start with my yellow highlight color. It's the yellow green, and then I work in the light greens and the medium greens and the dark greens. And I'm basically just starting, the top of each bush is going to be lighter, and then each bush is going to have a slight gradient. It's going to get slightly darker and darker until you get to the next bush and the next bush, and so on. For the paper, I am using 80-pound paper. I usually use between 65 and 80-pound paper. I don't recommend using printer paper. Printer paper is just too thin. It's 20 pound. And while it uses less ink because the paper saturates quicker, it's just less forgiving. The ink will dry a lot quicker on you, and it can't take as much of a beating. So if you're trying to use a chisel tips are great for going lighter. If you try to use the chisel tip on printer paper, you might just tear right through the paper. So you want something that can take a little bit of beating. I've tried doing like 110 stock or like 120, and that's actually just a little overkill. You don't need that much. So I'm wrapping up the bushes here, and what I do is I go in, I do all my layers, lightest, medium, darkest, and then I go back over everything with a light green, and I kind of just use those light colors as blender markers. So with the light colors, you start with them, and then you kind of finish with them. They really help bring everything together. And then once I've gone over with the light green, I come back in with my highlighters and just hit the highlights one more time. So those light colors you end up using quite a bit more than you do, say, the darker colors. So if you color a lot, you're going to end up running out of the light colors sooner than the dark colors. Fortunately, Ohuhu sells a pastel set, which really comes in handy. You can also use the blender marker for blending, but the blender marker does lighten up the ink. That's what it's really used for, more so, is lightening up ink as opposed to actually blending the colors together. It's easier to blend colors together just using a light color just a lighter color, so a light green for the example of the bushes. So I'm doing the same thing here with the vegetation up front. Now I use the fine tip for some of these thinner leaves, and I rarely use the fine tip. The fine tip is best on dry paper. The ink doesn't really flow that well out of the fine tip, so if you're trying to fade things together or there's already ink on the paper, the fine tip just doesn't work all that well because the ink is going to want to flow from kind of like a very wet, saturated area, like the tip of your brush tip on your marker, to a dry spot, like a dry piece of paper. But if you're applying it onto a very wet piece of paper, the ink isn't going to flow as well. So when you use the fine tip and it doesn't have a great flow to begin with, it's just not going to flow all that well if you put it onto very wet paper. So 9 times out of 10, I use the brush tip. I don't use the chisel tip too much. I usually use the chisel tip in a larger area where I'm just applying a lot of ink. And that's more so to preserve the brush tip, which can kind of take a little bit of a beating. Fortunately, the brush tips you can pull out, flip around, and put back in, so you get 2 uses out of it. But still, every single time you use that brush tip, it takes a little bit of damage, even if you're pushing lightly. So you'll generally, the markers will run out of ink probably around the same time that your brush tip is on its last limb. So it kind of times out pretty well, unless you like to push really, really hard with the brush tip. Now for the water here, I'm coloring in a very large surface area, and I'm using a light blue that only has a chisel tip and a fine tip. And some of the key things to note when you are coloring in a very large area is that you just want to monitor, you want to try to have an even distribution of ink. You're probably going to end up wanting to go over each area a minimum of 2 times. 3 times is even better. And as you're working, there's 2 things that you want to kind of keep in mind. Look back at areas you've already done and see how the ink is drying. You might not have applied like a very even coat of ink, and some areas might dry up a little bit quicker than others. So if you start to see that, the paper will start to turn white, it turns a little splotchy, and basically what's happening is the ink is going into the paper, and then you're starting to see the white of the paper, and so you just want to go over that spot again. A good trick to this is you can actually flip the paper over, look at the back side, and that will kind of tell you how much ink you've applied in a certain area. Generally, you'll notice that like the open areas, you don't go over quite as much because you can just gloss over them real quickly. But something like an edge that you have to go a little bit slower, when you flip the paper over and you look at that, the ink is going to flow out a little bit more towards edges just because you're going slower and the ink has more time to flow in that area. The other thing to keep in mind when you're doing a large area is that you want to keep your leading edge wet. So as I'm filling in different areas and I've got kind of a border between the wet ink and the dry paper, I want to just kind of keep that leading edge wet. Just revisit it every, 30, 60 seconds or so. Because when we apply ink, we want to apply it to ink that's already wet on the paper. If you apply it to ink that's dried up completely, it will end up leaving a line. So I'm using some darker blues here in the background and underneath the lily pads. I'm also using some kind of purplish, bluish colors to indicate these ripples. And I'm just kind of going with what the image had. The image showed ripples, so I'm just kind of following those gradients, or excuse me, those lines that they gave me, and it actually looks really nice. You don't even end up seeing the light grays that they had put down for the ripples, just because I go over them with a darker marker than the very light gray that came down. So I'm getting close to the end here, and I usually save the main character for last. And the reason why I do that is because it's easier to choose your colors when you have surrounding colors already on the paper. So I can compare the frog to its background and its surroundings and make sure that it fits. If I had started with the frog, I wouldn't really know how dark to go. I wouldn't really know how much shadow it needs and the right tones and the right darkness. But here I can get it to fit into its environment. And so 9 times out of 10, I save the main character for last. And actually, in this case, I will be honest, I think I went a little bit too dark with the frog. And I may have gone over it a few too many times. And so the ink, if you go over something too many times, the ink starts to kind of bleed a little bit and it saturates and everything becomes a little bit more monotone. So for the frog, I don't really end up with the shadows, as much shadow as I would like, as much contrast, but it still looks pretty good. And for that reason, I give myself a B+ on this drawing. I think I could have done a little bit better on the frog, but I think everything else turned out really, really well. Here I'm using the blender marker to just lighten up some of those areas that I thought went too dark. And then that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.